Hey, it's Jordan. Delighted to be joined by David Sirota. He has the Daily Poster, which is on Substack, pumping out great investigative content. He is also with, I think, editor-at-large with Jacobin, and was a senior advisor on the Bernie Sanders campaign. How you doing, David?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
So I guess I wanted to start kind of in the weeds because I thought your piece today on Joe Manchin, I call him President Manchin now, it was really interesting. Shocker, his opposition to a 28% tax rate for corporations seems to be benefiting some private equity and rich people. Can you kind of expand upon what you found as far as Manchin's stance and how it affects private equity?
Sure. The corporate tax rate was a big decider for major private equity firms. These are these huge Wall Street firms that buy up other companies and oftentimes strip them down, impose mass layoffs on those companies. That's what private equity is. A number of private equity firms, after Donald Trump lowered the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%, converted to C corporations, converted from partnerships to C corporations in order to take advantage of that much lower corporate tax rate. They made essentially a big financial bet on those lower corporate tax rates. And whether or not that bet pays off for those private equity firms and their billionaire owners is in part predicated on whether the corporate tax rate remains as low as Donald Trump and the Republicans put it. And so now you've got Joe Biden, who's come into office, saying that he doesn't want to restore the corporate tax rate to where it was for decades, 35%, but wants to return it to 28%, which is essentially right between where it was and where it currently is now. So a very, very modest, moderate proposal. But of course, the private equity industry bet on 21%. And you better believe that their kind of financial projections are predicated on that 21%. They have also, that industry has given a lot of money to West Virginia Democratic Senator Joe Manchin. I mean, West Virginia is one of the poorest states in the country, but Joe Manchin is bankrolled by a lot of the richest people in the country. People, by the way, who are a lot of them not from West Virginia. In fact, one of his top donors are donors from one of the major private equity firms, one of the big ones that converted to a C corporation and that is presumably banking on the corporate tax rate remaining at 21%. So what do you know? The money goes in from the private equity industry to Joe Manchin's campaign, including from one of the major private equity firms that made this bet on these lower tax rates. And what do you know? Joe Manchin is the first Democratic voice in Congress to come out and say, I am not going to support moving the tax rate, the corporate tax rate, back up even to 28%, much less back to 35%. I only want it at 25%. Now, granted, that's an increase, but it's a really, really tiny increase at a time when, of course, corporate tax receipts have plummeted. So, in a sense, you have Joe Manchin taking a position on an issue against the president of his own party, and that stance just so coincidentally happens to benefit in a very real way the private equity and Wall Street donors to his campaign. Now, I realize that's not probably for folks who are watching here, that's probably not a huge surprise that money goes in and legislative favors go out. But in this case, I would just say, it's such an explicit connection, right? I mean, you literally had this industry make a bet on this specific policy. And then the first senator who comes out and says they're going to try to stop this happens to be a guy who's been bankrolled by that industry. I mean, it is a perfect example of how politics really works.
Well, to me, something lost in the discussion, I mean, you certainly won't hear it on Morning Joe. I mean, 28, 35, very few of these corporations are paying the actual number and will be paying the actual number. It was a recent study that said 55 of the biggest corporations didn't pay any taxes last year. So I feel like, yeah, Manchin is doing the bidding of donors, but this corporate tax conversation being lost in that is there doesn't seem to be any actual enforcement in
that's a good point. And
these
look,
companies
Amazon
paying
today,
these taxes.
Amazon today came out, Jeff Bezos, of all people, came out today, put out a statement saying they want to see infrastructure investments and that they actually believe that a corporate tax rate should be higher than it is. Now, some people can look at that and be like, wow, Amazon's really kind of, they're being good people. The other way to look at it is that Amazon has managed to escape basic taxes through all sorts of financial shenanigans. It's not paying even close to the corporate tax rate because there's all sorts of loopholes baked into the tax system. So if you're not paying the corporate tax rate as it is, then in a sense, you wouldn't care whether the corporate tax rate is 100% because you've figured out a way legally under a loophole-riddled system to get around even paying the corporate tax rate, which speaks to, of course, the bigger issue that no matter what the rate is, that unless you actually simplify the corporate tax system, unless you actually beef up corporate tax enforcement, that the rate can be whatever you want to put it at, you still have a systemic problem. Now, I think two things can be true at the same time. What the rate is important, and also whether the rate is being universally equally applied without loopholes is also important. And those are two problems that operate essentially in tandem to create a situation where, as of last year, 55 of the largest corporations in America did not pay any corporate taxes. Essentially, they were able to write down, even though they were profitable, they were able to essentially evade paying taxes through all sorts of write-offs and loopholes. So that's what you have no matter what the rate is when you have a corporate tax rate that is low and you have a corporate tax enforcement system that is basically, if not non-existent, that's basically minimal. And you have a corporate tax structure that is riddled with loopholes.
And I wanted to ask you, because obviously you worked on the Hill for many years. You worked on Bernie's campaign. Obviously there's a food fight, as usual, on the left. But it seems to me Joe Manchin's one person, yet he's kind of having equal, if not more power than President Biden, not on foreign policy, obviously, but domestically. He's basically said, I'm going to shut things down if I don't get my way. Yet Bernie, the squad plus however many there are, 7 to 10, have, on the coronavirus bill, they chose, let's just take what we can get. And now on the infrastructure, they're not even preemptively saying, dead on arrival unless we get X, Y, and Z. You've kind of written about that in terms of leveraging power and why is Manchin doing so, but it doesn't seem like the progressives are. Have you found any answers? Is there some long-term strategy we don't know about? Because I'm kind of baffled. I'm not calling them frauds, but I'm kind of baffled why you do have the numbers, more numbers than Joe Manchin, but the progressives in the House and Senate aren't playing that hardball.
Well, I think I'm inferring here that what they believe is that the foundation of the legislation, the various bills in question, are inherently more progressive than the current status quo. So they believe that the foundation of what they have, whether a corporate tax reform, the infrastructure bill, the stimulus bill, that the basics of the bill are good, and that if they fight too hard, draw too many lines in the sand over additional good things, that it could somehow take down the entire bill, which they care about because they would argue that the foundation of the bill, whether the other things that are get put in it or not, are good. And that Manchin and that the right wing of the Democratic Party more generally doesn't care about the good things in the bill, is willing to take down those good things of the bill if they don't get their way on the things that they want. And look, in fairness, I think that's a matter of opinion. right? I mean, I have my opinion. You have your opinion. The progressives in Congress have their opinion on whether they're driving a hard enough bargain, whether it is actually true that in a sort of alternate future, whether a bill would get taken down or not if they draw a line in the sand. My view is that they have a lot of leverage that they have refused to use, especially on must-pass pieces of legislation that the White House considers signature initiatives, that by drawing lines in the sand, making clear demands, that they will pull Joe Biden off of the sidelines in many ways, force the White House to actually use its enormous power, the enormous power of the executive branch, to actually move legislation, pressure the right wing of the Democratic Party to get on board. And that the only way to actually motivate them is to say, if X, Y, and Z is not in the bill, you cannot count on our votes. Obviously, that's exactly what Joe Manchin does, right? Joe Manchin, I mean, literally on the corporate tax rate this week, he said something to the effect of, I don't want it at 28%. I want it at 25%, and I'm essentially not going to vote for anything that doesn't provide me what I want. That's essentially saying I'm happy to take this bill down if my demands on this issue are not met, and that's where he draws his power. And progressives have a similar amount of power that they have not been willing to use. And it's my view that if they did use that power, let's use the corporate tax rate as an example. If the progressives said, listen, we're not voting for a bill that doesn't have a corporate tax rate, at least where Joe Biden is proposing it to be, at 28%. Like, our line in the sand is just where even this Democratic president says he is. Then you've got one poll of the party saying we're drawing a line in the sand at 28%. You've got Joe Manchin saying he's drawing a line in the sand at 25%. And now you've got a situation in which Joe Biden and the executive branch has to not just sort of step back and say, hey, you guys work it out. They've actually got to engage. And that's actually what we want, or what we should want, a dynamic in which the White House is using its enormous political power to actually drive the agenda. Now, I know there are some folks who say, well, this is a lot of nonsense. The president doesn't have very much power. There's this whole idea, the so-called Green Lantern theory that kind of pundits use to mock the left. This idea that the progressives seem to think that the president has all this power and the president's a superhero, and actually he doesn't have any power. And of course, this narrative shifts every 4 years, right? Like, if there's a Republican president, we're supposed to believe the president is all powerful. When there's a Democratic president, we're supposed to believe the president has absolutely no power to do anything. It's a lot of nonsense. The president is enormously powerful. The executive branch has an enormous amount of legislative power. You may ask, well, what kind of power? Well, the executive branch is making all sorts of decisions about where spending happens, where projects go. There's all sorts of flexibility and authority that the executive branch has. Members of Congress want, I'm giving you one example here, they want spending in their district. They want projects in their district, and the president has the ability to choose that. Now, I'm not saying you got to go about it in a kind of corrupt way that Donald Trump often went about it, but this has been the push and pull of politics for 100 years, right? Like Lyndon Johnson, other presidents of both parties. This is how you wield power. And the point is that in order for progressives to get what they say they want, they're going to have to try to animate the president to use that power to pressure the right wing of the Democratic Party in Congress.
Well, I also think it goes to psychology, because besides the fact that obviously he fooled a lot of people, one of the biggest problems President Obama, or weaknesses, he left his huge organizing army on the White House lawn. I mean, he ran one of the best campaigns to that point ever. He had this huge army of volunteers, huge army of activists, and he just left them at the altar. And I think right now, progressives have significantly more than Joe. There's not a huge army behind Joe Manchin other than Wall Street, whereas Bernie still has, his campaign apparatus, maybe not, the actual apparatus, but the movement behind it. Same thing goes for the squad. So I get the notion of, this is better than nothing, but people didn't necessarily elect these folks to get that better than nothing, they elected them, as AOC said, to bring the ruckus to the Democratic Party. So I do think there's a bit of, kind of a not using your leverage when it's just a gaping opportunity, especially during a pandemic, which is a segue to this next question, because I see the media just like asserting as fact that, Joe Manchin has to act this way because it's the only way he could win in West Virginia. And basically painting this picture that places like West Virginia, they don't want a $15 minimum wage wouldn't be popular there. Medicare for all wouldn't be popular over there. I mean, it's just not true. And it goes down the list. Part of why Trump was popular there was because he fooled people into thinking he was a populist. And they liked that populist rhetoric. So do you feel like, Bernie was asked on MSNBC, well, would you go to West Virginia and pressure Manchin? I mean, couldn't the same thing be said for the progressives pressuring Biden? Because from what it stands now, I'm not hearing anything about $15 minimum wage. Okay, we couldn't get it because the, president parliamentarian, which is another topic. But I don't see any follow through on, all right, let's make that the priority now before infrastructure. I mean, you don't have a crystal ball, but I guess I'm asking, why don't progressives pressure Biden the same way that Manchin is pressuring Biden?
Well, I think they have been brought into the White House. They have a relationship with the presidential administration that they haven't had really in at least probably in my lifetime. Meaning, what I mean by that is that the Biden administration has done a good job of creating a dialogue, of making them feel valued by having meetings with them and making them feel part of the process. It's smart politics. I want to credit to the Biden folks. I mean, it's not rocket science, right? I mean, but credit to the Biden folks nonetheless for making the progressive wing of the party feel like they're part of the conversation, which, by the way, is different than how the Obama administration treated progressive members of Congress. Now, of course, the downside is that getting essentially schmoozed, getting worked, getting made to feel like, hey, we're all friends, we're all working together. And again, I'm not against, sort of team spirit and everyone standing in solidarity. But, there's a fine line between, solidarity, allyship, and getting schmoozed and worked. And the problem is that the problem is that when push comes to shove, you have to be willing to have that meeting with, Chief of Staff Ron Klain, or have that meeting with Joe Biden and be cordial and nice and civil, and then say, if it's great, I'm glad to be here in the Oval Office, but if you don't meet my demands, you don't have my vote. And I don't think yet that progressive lawmakers in Congress, by and large, have figured out how to have a working relationship with the White House while also standing their ground in a clear way. I think, frankly, a lot of them are probably afraid that if they stood their ground and created any kind of direct conflict with the White House, that they would lose that access, that they would lose that relationship. And to be honest, maybe they would. But ultimately, the question is, why are you there? Right. Ultimately, the only power, I would say the biggest power, a rank and file member of Congress, let's say in the House has, is their vote. Right. Everything else is sort of soft power, press releases and the public platform and going on TV. But the hard power that you have as a member of Congress, especially in a narrow house, a narrowly divided house, is your vote. That's where your real power is. And, another example of this is the conservative Democrats in the House have said that they won't vote for a tax reform package unless it includes new deductions for state and local taxes, which is essentially would mostly benefit the very wealthy in this country. That's not disputable. That's just data. Some Democrats from wealthier districts have said we will not vote for a tax package unless these tax breaks are put in the bill. And essentially what they have done, we talked about the Manchin example, but what they have done in the same way is say, look, we understand that our power in a narrowly divided House is our vote, and we're threatening to withhold our vote unless our demands are met. And the progressive members of Congress have never done that. They have not done. Now, it's still early. Maybe they will do that, but they have not yet done that. And ultimately, my view is if they don't do that on some basic issues like a $15 minimum wage, good example, then it reduces the chance that those priorities will ultimately get legislated. And
also, at the bottom line is, it doesn't matter if you have access if they're just going to moonwalk on every promise they made. I mean, Biden made one promise. I mean, he talked about restore the soul of blah, blah, blah. $15 minimum wage. That's the only economic promise he made. You could throw in $2,000 checks, and he's moonwalking. And part of why he's moonwalking, because there's no one to challenge him. And I think AOC and these progressives, they know how to whip up a crowd on social media, digital media, organizing, even during a pandemic. And it's kind of like you're not using one of your best tools, just like Obama. Obama could have barnstormed the country if he wanted to against McConnell and the rest. They're just choosing not to. Wanted to ask you also
and let me add one quick thing. They could be the lowest profile members of Congress. The progressive caucus members of Congress. If you give me 10 of those members of Congress who have no Twitter feeds, no public profile at all, but they simply say, we are 10 members of Congress, 10 Democrats. Our votes are needed to pass any legislation because there's no Republican votes available for something, for most things that the Biden administration is pushing. They're all going to vote no. So you need our 10 votes to pass anything. And we have no public profile at all, but we have these demands. You must meet these demands to get our vote. Now you've created a problem for the White House. Now you've created a problem that Joe Biden needs to fix, needs to use the power of the White House to get a deal that, if not satisfies those demands, at least moves legislation at least closer to those demands, at least incorporates some of those demands.
And I wanted to ask you, because I don't know, I watch CNN and these platforms, so my viewers don't have to. I mean, they made this $1.9 trillion deal into the New Deal. I mean, I don't want to, there are good things in it. Let's not say there aren't. But this is not structural change. I mean, okay, you're cutting poverty in half for 6 months to a year until everything expires. There's nothing permanent in there in terms of eviction protection, foreclosure protection. It all was just kind of kick the can down the road. So are you seeing anything in your reporting, obviously the infrastructure proposal, are you seeing anything that's actual structural change as far as, a wider safety net for people, more benefits? Because I'm seeing a lot of things that are short term look very good, but in the long term do not change anything structurally to decrease income inequality, strengthen labor unions. I mean, the list goes on. To me, it all looks like a very nice Band-Aid for a gaping gunshot wound.
Yeah, I mean, I think they would argue, the proponents of the first stimulus bill would argue that it was only designed to be a bridge. It wasn't designed to be a new foundation, and take that for what it is. But I certainly agree with you. At a snapshot of this moment in time, what has passed has been a bridge spending to help bridge people through a very difficult economic situation. It is not a foundation has not yet been built. Now, will they permanently extend the child support benefits that were in this bill temporarily? Will they pass the PRO Act to structurally change labor law in America, to strengthen union rights, to strengthen the ability of workers to bargain for more economic resources? Will they pass a minimum wage, which structurally changes the economy to force employers to pay people better? Will they change the corporate tax rate, which will structurally change the tax system? Those are the open questions. I think it's not easy, but it's certainly easier to pass things that are spending based, that are temporary, that do not fundamentally change the structure of the economy. Joe Biden's famous comment, nothing will fundamentally change. So far, I would argue nothing has fundamentally changed. Things have certainly temporarily changed, and that's better than nothing changing at all. But the open question right now, you've spotlighted it correctly. The open question is, will anything structurally or fundamentally change about the economy, about the relationship between labor and capital, about the structure of how the economy works? Those are the big questions. Those are the much harder fights. And it remains to be seen which way those fights will go.
Lastly, I wanted to ask you, and this is kind of I guess, a human being question. I think you and I are similar in that I'm kind of just dumbfounded as an investigative reporter. I think not that it's easy to break stories, but like in a normal journalistic world, you know, you breaking this amazing story on Andrew Cuomo, which you and the Daily Poster broke like almost a year ago, on him basically handing out, you know, corporate liability shields as he sent old people to their deaths. I mean, that would be on the front page of every newspaper, and it would just be like lightning because that's just corruption. But it's gotten attention, but he's basically been able to kind of surf it out. Obviously, there's other stuff with him, the sexual harassment allegations, the preferable treatment for his son and his brother, Chris Cuomo, and his family getting, you know, COVID testing delivery. But I wanted to ask you, kind of as an investigative journalist, it's got to be frustrating when you break these stories. It's frustrating for me on the Flint end of things. I've been working on Flint. You're breaking great stories, but the media kind of like, all right, they talk about it, but like they don't actually cover it as a corrupt story. So I wanted to ask you, you know, just your thoughts from the journalistic end. You broke a major story, but because the media didn't really take that and apply much pressure onto him on the nursing homes, he's still there.
Yeah, I mean, look, you know, it's a question of impact. How do you have impact when you do reporting? I mean, I would say, look, I'm most gratified on that story that you mentioned about Cuomo and corporate immunity, that the New York legislature, both houses of the New York legislature, have voted to repeal that law. And the legislators who led the fight to repeal that law, you know, publicly said that they would. That part of what helped them do that was the reporting that we did. So I think, yeah, Andrew Cuomo is still there, but hopefully, I mean, he has to decide whether to sign that law or not, but hopefully that law will be repealed. And so that is impact. Now, I certainly agree with you that we live in a media environment in which substance is a very small part of the pie. Prognostication, punditry, and speculation, horse race politics, all that nonsense is a much larger slice of the pie. But I also think that there are more conduits for people to get information now. I think that we are in and maybe this is just me being overly optimistic, but I believe that as dark a moment as it is for the traditional media industry, that you've seen mass layoffs of good journalists. You've seen a corporatization, even more so than there had been in the past, a corporatization of the media. I think we are also seeing alternative channels. I mean, we're on one right now. We're communicating on one right now. I mean, you know, the journalism outlet I've set up, that's one small piece of hopefully a larger movement to create a more independent and vibrant press. I am encouraged by that. I don't think it's going to change overnight. Look, I know everyone is hoping and always looking for, you know, a kind of silver bullet solution, a really quick solution. Unfortunately, there are no, I don't believe, quick solutions to a 40 or 50-year corporatization of the media, a disconnection of the media from the population. Not to idealize the past, by the way. There were plenty of problems back in the Citizen Kane era and the like. But my point is that it's going to take a lot of work over a relatively long period of time to build a much more vibrant press that is able to not only report out stories, but to consistently focus in on the substance of stories over not just one news cycle, but many news cycles, and to really create a different kind of information ecosystem. But again, I am optimistic that that is what's happening right now. I just know that it's not going to happen tomorrow, or the completion of that project is not going to happen tomorrow or next week or next month.
Definitely. Well, I really enjoyed your work the last few months, so Thank you for that.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And I appreciate your work on covering the story in Flint. I mean, it was really, really important. It's an incredibly important story, and your persistence in it was really, really, really significant. And I'm sure it was demoralizing at times, and maybe remains demoralizing. That story has only kind of popped up every now and again in the larger media ecosystem, but it doesn't mean that the work isn't important. It is.
I'll give you and the viewers a sneak peek. In fact, an NBC News editor last week, when I presented evidence of destruction of evidence when it comes to Flint, told me basically this is nice, but it was a long time ago. So that's the state of our media. And it's not just Flint. I mean, I broke a story in January about an Amazon worker who literally died suddenly. She was testing other workers for COVID. So Amazon literally had just regular workers administering nasal swabs. Crystal and Sagar had me on about it, but other than that, I mean, crickets. So there's a lot of that, as you know, breaking important stories, but it being difficult to kind of break through the daily horse race, obviously the last 5 years of the 24/7 Trump cycle, and now other distractions. But
well, keep at it. It's important.
Thanks, David. Everybody check him out on Substack, The Daily Poster, and we'll stay in touch.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
Hope you enjoyed that last video. Hop on over to statuscoup.com where you can sign up for our email list and become a member for as low as $5 to $10 a month. Membership is how we grow. That's statuscoup.com/join. And remember, join our email list so we can grow the revolution with you.